There exists a threat, from anti-hunting groups to politicians trying to give our land away, and we won't stand for it. Those vast western landscapes provide the space for our wildlife to thrive and a place for hunters and anglers to fuel the fire that sparks their soul. In this show, we share our love of hunting, fishing, and conservation. Here, we provide the foundation to meet these threats through passion and the grit of the American outdoorsman. Welcome to the Western Huntsman Podcast. Hey guys, what's up? This is Jim Huntsman, Western Huntsman Podcast. This is episode number 11, coming at you from Hayden, Idaho. Appreciate you guys listening in and tuning in. This is going to be the part 2 episode with Director Ed Schriever of the Idaho Fish and Game. We really get into the meat of Idaho wildlife management. Some of the more contentious issues are in this part 2 episode. You guys are going to really like it. I appreciate you guys tuning in. Man, just the support we've gotten so far on this podcast has been overwhelming. I really appreciate it, guys. It's super humbling. We've had a lot more downloads on these episodes than I really imagined. I kind of had a game plan to get a certain amount for the first 10 or so episodes or whatever, and start building from there. And we blew those numbers out weeks ago. Substantially. In fact, I'm overwhelmed with it. It's been really cool. So I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys helping us grow too. I'm asking everybody, if you guys would just share this podcast with one person, it would grow super fast, and that's always good for us on this end. We appreciate it. So this episode again is going to be with Director Ed Schriever. And it's the part 2 episode. If you didn't listen last week to last week's episode, you're going to want to listen to that before you listen to this one. So make sure you go back and tune in on that part 1 series from last week, because the context won't make sense if you just kick it off with this episode. So lots of good stuff in this one. I wanted to talk just real quick about gear and some of the things I've been seeing and some of the messages I've been getting. People are asking me kind of, what's some of the gear I use? And I'm not going to get into that in this episode in terms of the gear that I use, and for 2 reasons. First, you guys probably don't want to use the gear that I use. I'm not like a gear junkie. I have my favorites. I have the things that I use that have proven to work for me in the field. And I'm going to stick to them, but I'm not like a big-time gear junkie. I don't get into, this brand versus that brand. I pick up what works well for me. That's reason number 1. Down the road, I will get into some of the gear stuff, and we can talk about that. But part number 2 to that is a kind of almost a simplified or a simpleton version when we're talking about gear, in terms of what makes you a good hunter, what makes you an effective hunter. And I will tell you that it's not a $700 pack. It's not a $500 pair of boots. It's not Sitka gear versus First Light versus QU, or all these different awesome manufacturers of this outdoor equipment that we use when we're hunting. I love all these guys, and I love all these companies, and they do great things, and they have great products. So don't take this wrong, but that's not the stuff that's going to make you effective in the field. You might not know this about me, but I'm a major Civil War buff. I'm a history buff, and specifically, I love studying, researching, reading about the Civil War, the American Civil War. The Civil War from 1861 to 1865 is a super interesting time. And I'm going to tell you kind of how that ties into what the message is of this intro that I'm going to talk about right now. In the second spring of the Civil War, let me tell you a little story. In the second spring of the Civil War, this guy named Stonewall Jackson was tasked with going into the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia to kind of thwart off a threat of Union forces coming out of Washington, D.C. Because, you see, the goal of the Union, the Northern forces and the Northern armies, the goal in the Eastern Theater of the war was to capture Richmond. Richmond being the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War, right? So they had this plan to send a large force down onto the peninsula, which is like southeast of Richmond. And then in conjunction with that, they were sending another force through the Shenandoah to approach Richmond from the north to kind of put them in like this pincer movement, right? So Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee was not the commander of the Confederate forces at this point, but he was an advisor to the president of the Confederacy. And he suggested that they send somebody up to kind of thwart that northern threat coming out of Washington, D.C. So they choose Stonewall Jackson, send Stonewall Jackson up there with about 17,000 men to thwart off these northern armies that were substantially larger than his. In that time, the Shenandoah campaign was about 48 days long. In that time, Stonewall Jackson's troops marched approximately 650 miles during that time span. So if you do the math on that, 650 miles is a lot of that's like 13 and a half. Let's see, I'm trying to do the math in my head here, and you guys know I'm not good at math. That's about 13 and a half miles or so a day for 48 days. Now, some days they did 20 miles, some days they did 5 miles. But the point that I'm trying to make is these were Southern Confederate troops that were not well funded like the Union armies. They didn't have new boots. They didn't have a lot of the gear and essentials. A lot of these guys were marching in their socks. They were marching barefoot, or they were marching with these boots that were falling off. So the boots that they used were called brogans. Now, I'm not going to tell you why I have experience with brogans, but I'm going to tell you that I have put a lot of miles on a pair of brogans, and I still have them in my basement. I'm not going to tell you why, because I don't want you to know the extent of my nerdism when it comes to the Civil War. So we're just going to leave it at that. But I have a lot of experience with brogans. Brogans are these leather boots with a small heel on the sole, right? And they are not exactly a pair of Kenetrex or Hoffman boots. They're not comfortable. They're not form-fitting. They don't fit right, and they suck to hike in. These guys did that with these brogans until they flat out wore off their feet, and they ended up marching barefoot. The point is that they did it. They did it with these brogans. They did it barefoot. They did it in socks. They also delivered a couple of ass whoopings to the northern armies up there. During that time, it was an incredible military campaign if you look at it in like a historic manner. You know, and I'm not trying to glorify one side or the other with the Civil War. What I'm trying to do is highlight what, if you look back in the past and through history, and what we have available to us in the field. These are the things that took place. This is actual fact, and I experienced it as well. A lot of you know that I was in the Marines, and I was an infantry Marine, and we hiked a lot of miles with the boots that I was using in the Marines. Cost me $60 at the PX on base, and we had to. I went through several pair of these jungle boots that, they issue them to you at first in boot camp, but after that you got to buy them yourself, right? So they're not exactly great boots either. They're not as form-fitting. They're not these high-end boots that you can get today at whether you're ordering online or going to Cabela's or something. These are just crappy jungle boots, and I put a lot of miles on these boots. So what I'm trying to do, guys, is just highlight that this really expensive gear that many of you stress out about having in the field is not what's going to make you a great hunter. Think of those guys in the Shenandoah Valley as they're hiking 650 miles in 48 days with brogans and until those brogans wore off to the point they couldn't get resupplied and were walking the rest of the way barefoot. This is like, that's crazy shit. That it's insane to think about. These guys endured that kind of punishment to their feet, right? So I'm going to tell you guys a couple of things that will make you a good hunter instead of worrying about gear, because the guys that are asking me these questions are usually, they're younger, they're in their 20s, maybe they've got a young family, they're just starting out, and this stuff is super expensive, and you shouldn't prioritize it just yet, guys. Just the expensive gear is going to come in time. What you need right now is experience and time in the field. That's what makes you a good hunter. That's what's going to create consistency in success, whether you're elk hunting or deer hunting or turkey hunting or bear hunting, it doesn't matter. The time in the field is what's going to create consistent success for you, not $500 boots, $700 packs, $3,000 bows. Those kind of things are awesome to have, and I encourage you to work towards getting them. But don't sweat it, man. If you have a choice to hunt with one elk tag this year, and let's say you're in Idaho, and you have a chance to either buy a pair of expensive boots or an expensive pack, or instead of spending that money on those items, turn around and buy a second tag in, say, Montana or Wyoming or Colorado, take the second tag, because that second tag is what's going to make you a better hunter, not the gear, not the equipment. That's not to say, again, I'm not picking on that high-end equipment. I have some. I have a lot of it. And if you guys ever, I'll give you my boot recommendation. There's some great boots out there between Schnee's and Kinnetrek and Hoffman. I'm a Hoffman guy. I like my Hoffman boots. They've done well for me, and I'll probably never switch. But other than that, don't sweat the gear. Don't spend a bunch of money that you don't need to. Spend the money on the tags. And who is that says that? There's a podcast I was listening to. I'm trying to think. Oh, the Rich Outdoors. Cody Rich. He talks about that. He says this a lot. Buy tags, not gear. I totally agree with him. That's what your focus should be on. If your focus is your budget is tight, but you want to get out there and you want to become a great hunter and work towards having this consistent success year after year, it's time in the woods and being committed to that hunt and being dedicated to success each and every year, each and every hunt you go on. That's what you guys really, I want you to focus on, because I want you to be successful. It's one of the reasons I started this podcast was to help people be successful. And one of the things that is going to make a huge impact over anything you can buy is going to be time in the woods with a tag in your pocket and getting that experience under your belt. I promise you that is going to be the most wisest investment for you at this point. So enough on that. So I went off on a rant. You guys got a little Civil War history lesson there, and hope you enjoyed it. I also want to real quickly mention that if you guys are in the Coeur d'Alene, Idaho area, this weekend, March 7th, is when the Foundation for Wildlife Management is having our banquet. It's going to be a big deal. They've got a lot of excellent prizes. If you guys don't have tickets to get into the Foundation for Wildlife Management banquet yet, you need to make sure you get those, because that's coming up. And then they have other banquets. I think on April 4th is the one in the Clearwater down in Lewiston, and then they have another one coming up in Boise, I believe. I'll have to check on that. Anyway, just wanted to throw that out there. Foundation for Wildlife Management, they're the ones that will connect people that want wolves managed with the people that can have the ways and means to get the job done. So make sure you're a member. It's a $35 membership. Again, when you're on foundationforwildlifemanagement.org and you are signing up as a new member, and if you mention the Western Huntsman podcast and the little line that asks you where you found out about the foundation, put in the Western Huntsman podcast, you'll be entered in to win an elk hunting package from Phelps Game Calls. That's going to be a bugle tube and an elk reed. So make sure you're doing that. All right, guys, that is all I wanted to cover in this little intro on this episode. Again, we're going to get back into it with part 2 of my interview with the director of Idaho Fish and Game, Director Ed Schriever. Really good guy. I want to thank him one more time for coming on. You got to think about it from his perspective. It's kind of risky coming on a show. He might not know much about this show. He didn't know where this show, the direction we were going to take it, and what questions I might throw at him. I sent him a list of questions, which I do on every show with every guest, but it was kind of risky for him to come up and do that, so I appreciate him doing that. I think we got a lot of really good information covered in this episode. It's my favorite episode. All right, guys, here we go. Director Ed Schriever, part number 2. I want to address wolves in this context, since we weren't supposed to get to this point yet. But
so before we do this, let me bring this back to the comment. So My point with every time the commission advanced the season framework for wolves, whether trapping or hunting, every time we heard the same outcry from the same people from across the country that this is prima facie evidence of Idaho's war on wolves, and this will be the extermination of wolves as we know it. And that is not true.
So
that is not the fact. The fact is the wolf population is still orders of magnitude above what the state agreed to. Mm-hmm. Folks will argue whether the state agreed to it or not, but those recovery criteria, the wolf population is still way beyond that. And all of the cries from these same folks every time the regulations were changed that this is it, this is the end of wolves as we know it, simply has never manifested itself. And what the commission is trying to do is figure out what regulatory framework it takes to get hunting and trapping to a point where we're either just... So the most simple population model, Jim, is if birth equals death, the population stays constant. Mm-hmm. Okay? And if you want the population to get a little smaller, whether it's fish, elk, deer, or wolves, you have to have a little bit more mortality than you do birth.
Yep.
And so the commission has been incrementally getting to how much mortality can you put on them. Wolves are very productive. Unlike grizzly bears that might grow at 2% a year, wolves have the capability to grow at 30 or 40% a year. So as we look at the population, if you want the overall population to be smaller, deaths have to be greater than births. And we're just getting to the point where we understand the sources of mortality, and we now, one of the other high priority items that the commission and I agreed to was we will have an annual estimate of the wolf population in Idaho to know with certainty if that population is getting bigger or getting smaller with the implementation of hunting and trapping and control actions that we do in response to livestock depredations. So we've got it, and we plan to keep estimating the wolf population annually from this point forward.
What is the current estimate of the wolf population as of right now?
So, good question.
For
and again,
Idaho Fish and Game, I mean.
Again, not a short answer. So all populations fluctuate through the year. Okay? You have birth, and then you have death within a year. So whether it's elk and they calve in the spring, and then you have a hunting season, and then you have natural mortality, same thing with a wolf population. So the one thing I want to caution you and the listeners, the old population estimate for wolves, the last one we had was 2015. It was done using completely different methodology than the method we're using now. So they are not comparable.
Okay.
The method we're doing now estimates the population in its entire occupied range in Idaho. And we're doing that estimate primarily with game cameras, but it's supported with other genetic information. And we make that estimate in July, which is shortly after the pupping season.
Yep.
So that estimate is made at a time when the population is near its annual peak. And then through the fall, both through natural mortality, wolves die of natural causes, not man-related, and the tabulation of hunting take and trapping take and wolves taken in control actions, we do some subtraction because there's a mandatory report for all those mortalities. Then we can figure out what the low ebb of the population is from math, from subtracting the known mortalities and an estimate of natural mortality. But the POP estimate we made in July was 1,541.
Yeah, that's the number I saw.
Yep.
Wolves are a very touchy subject.
Absolutely.
And so I want to approach the entire topic I want people to understand.
And I hope we can talk about more than wolves.
Oh, we're gonna definitely. Because I'm actually super interested in the grizzly bear and how where we're at with and we'll circle back to that.
Sure.
But with wolves, because they're so contentious, there's a lot of people. This is kind of the general, especially in the northern Idaho area, the general philosophy, or maybe not philosophy is the right word to use, but kind of the feeling is people hate wolves with a passion that are hunters. A lot of this comes from people that have hunted elk up in this area for a long time, who have seen the decline in elk herds and whitetail and mule deer. It's not hard to point the finger at the wolf, right? Now, there's an extension to that where you have people that maybe put too much emphasis on the effect of wolves on elk and deer, and maybe they haven't been successful elk hunting, and it's super easy to say, well, it's because there's too many wolves. I'm not in that group, but I do think there's too many wolves, and I do sometimes question, why isn't Idaho Fish and Game doing more to help us get these wolf numbers under control?
So back to and it's a fair question. But I will go back to the advancement of the regulatory framework that the commission has put in place. And so let me just case in point, because there have been some things done just recently that have made a difference. And one rule that's going through the legislature right now that might make a difference, but it's got to get through the legislature before it can happen. So so we know right now that we've got about 300 licensed wolf trappers in the state. And we sell tens of thousands of wolf tags to hunters. I got one in my pocket just because if I might see one on an elk hunt, I might have a chance.
It's usually what I do.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm not really a wolf hunter. We have a few folks who are truly hunting a wolf. But trappers, with 300 of them, harvest as many, if not more, wolves in the state than do all the hunters combined. So trapping is a very effective tool in wolf management. There's a lot of emotion around trapping. There's a lot of folks who don't like trapping, and they especially don't like it for wolves because of the wolf issue is polar opposite.
Yeah,
right?
I totally agree.
And so we don't need to get into all the reasons about why the values around wolf management are polar opposite. But we know in Idaho that to manage the population, as the Constitution says, fishing and hunting and trapping is the primary method to manage our wildlife in this state, that trapping is going to be an important part of that.
Yeah.
If we look at the wolf take by trapping over the last 5 previous years, it averaged about 55 wolves annually in the fall. And that trapping season was November 15th through December 31st.
Okay. About
55 wolves statewide were taken during that trapping season. Last year, the commission put almost a month in front of November 15th. That was the first time they'd done that. They opened foothold trapping on October 10th. There were some concerns about bycatch of sporting dogs and other reasons that the commission went very cautiously and carefully with that decision. But my point is, the trappers were telling us we're really at a disadvantage with a November 15th opener, because when it starts to snow and freezing rain, foothold traps on the ground are hard to maintain.
Yeah, they get frozen and
they get frozen,
and so else, yep.
We really would like to have some time when they aren't going to be frozen. And so the commission gave an additional month. And they considered that with all the other competing interests on the landscape, certain places. But this last year, the fall foothold trapping harvest of wolves that used to average 55 a year was 138. So there are changes that are being made in the regulatory framework that are demonstrating a positive effect on the number of wolves harvested. Mm-hmm. The snaring rule, removing the requirement for diverters, which is a piece of a snare that's made to reduce bycatch of non-target animals, that hasn't really proven out to be necessary, but we know that trappers aren't employing snares because of the diverter rule. So the commission has removed the requirement for a diverter on a wolf snare. They're not required on any other snare in the state.
Gotcha.
And so we do expect more trappers to be using snares once this rule is authorized through the legislative process this year. And we could see another incremental bump in the harvest. And what the commission is trying to do is get to the place where they know what combination of things will allow for the management of wolf numbers in the state.
So the one thing that I always think about on this topic is Idaho. I think it's in the Idaho Wolf Conservation or Management Plan, mm-hmm. That the landscape is essentially large enough to allow for 300 to 500 wolves. Is that? I want to make sure I'm on base with that and not off base.
So, Jim, there were some original assumptions made at the time that wolves were going to be introduced into Idaho, and one of those assumptions was they're going to behave themselves and stay in the wilderness areas.
Yeah.
No. They didn't read the plan.
And I don't want to demonize any of those assumptions in a sense that we hadn't had wolves here,
right.
So we didn't know, right? And the Fish and Game didn't know, the public didn't know. So I don't want that demonized. Let's get back to what you were saying. Okay.
So and you talk about the stakeholders, and certainly the livestock industry is a big part in wolf management in the state. Mm-hmm. Those folks suffer losses at the hands of wolves, and we have really stepped up our work with the livestock industry in issuing kill permits to livestock producers in certain places to help them protect the resources that they have on the ground. Wildlife Services works under the auspices of the Wolf Depredation Control Board, which does have some general fund money. And that amounts to about an additional 80 wolves a year that are actively involved in livestock depredations are removed from the population. So that's another increment of harvest.
Yeah.
That's more of a strategic approach. Those are wolves causing problems. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that this is general population management. What the commission is doing with wolves is general population management and trying to find that place where hunting and trapping is an effective manager of the number of wolves in the state.
So do you feel like we've got 300 licensed trappers, right? And I can tell you, I've purposely gone out wolf hunting 3 times, I think. Never saw a wolf during those times. I've never actually seen wolves.
Right.
I've heard them a lot, and I see a lot of sign and things like that. So the point I'm trying to get at is, do you feel like that is sufficient to get the numbers reduced? Because would you agree that 1,500 over 1,500 wolves is too much for the state of Idaho?
Yes, I will, just because of the level of conflict. But I will also tell you that without the management that has been going on since 2011, there is a much higher capacity for wolves in this state than 1,500. So
the landscape can handle more. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
And the conflict level can go up. So I believe this wholeheartedly when I say management of wolves is absolutely in the best long-term interest for the conservation of wolves. If you don't manage these animals in this state with all of the diverse things that go on the landscape, it's going to come unhinged. The tolerance for 3,000 wolves in this state, you think there's low tolerance for 1,500. If they weren't being managed, I think there's a whole lot of capacity for more than what we currently have. The only thing that would limit wolves naturally would be disappearance of the prey base that they depend on.
And I think
that is not an option in Idaho.
Yeah, it's not.
No.
It shouldn't be. And I think that's where some people might disagree with you in the Panhandle in terms of we have the landscape or the capacity for more wolves. In that light, there's so many people, and I'm one of them. I feel like the number of elk that I encounter and deer and the habits, seeing the elk down on the agricultural interface and in these fields where we never saw them before. This has to be because of wolves, because that's the only the denominator that's made this change. The factor that has it's like super obvious. I think maybe in the Panhandle. We want less wolves up here. I am not on board with eliminating all wolves. I'm not one of those guys. I don't run around touting SSS all over social media and all that. Because that's crap. And it really, that kind of stuff needs to stop. That doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the anti-hunters. It doesn't help the pro-wolf people. It doesn't help the anti-wolf people. But we need less wolves in the Panhandle. And in like north central Idaho. We feel like our elk are getting hammered to the point of it's almost at the point of no return. Is the feeling and the perception that a lot of us get. What do you say to that?
So I think we've been making some progress. I don't think we're out of the woods yet, but I think we have had a return of some either sex elk hunting in North Idaho. I do know that it's not unique to North Idaho that elk behavior is different with abundant wolf populations on the landscape. But I'm not quick to say that's the only reason that elk behavior has changed as well.
Okay.
There are other factors. There was some really interesting research that came out of Montana on the role of irrigated agriculture or ag land in general and elk behavior. And it can get exacerbated by predators, two-legged and four-legged. So this work in Montana showed that cow elk, for example, have a migratory pattern where they spend the summers at high elevation, public land, and then they winter in low elevation. And this study showed that if cow elk came in contact with irrigated agriculture in the low elevation, and they were left unharassed on that land, it's super productive land. If they were not harassed, they were 50% less likely to return to the high country. Just because they got everything they need from a dietary standpoint.
Yeah.
And if that cow that was 50% less likely to leave that ag land had a calf, that calf was never going to leave that ag land because it
didn't know any better.
It did not know any different, and everything it needed was being met. And so some of the behavior that elk are exhibiting now in some places, not every place, is a result of a change in landowner willingness to have people hunt there and harass these animals off. Some folks liked the fact that they had 20 elk on their place. I would. Well, then 20 becomes 40. And 40 becomes 80. And when the 80 becomes 160, they got a problem. My point is, if you got two-legged hunters hunting around in the higher country and you have four-legged hunters, there's more than just wolves that affect elk behavior. It's a part of it.
Okay.
But we are doing monitoring of the wildlife populations in North Idaho and everywhere. North Idaho is one of 8 ecoregions that we put radio telemetry collars on deer and elk, and we determine cause-specific mortality. So of the calves, we have calves collared and we have adults collared, and we know when they die, and we send people out to investigate the cause of death. And of bears, lions, and wolves in North Idaho, wolves now are second to lions. So we do know, and then folks say, well, Ed, that's because the wolves are stealing the lion kills, so lions have to kill more because wolves are lazy and they just steal them from the lions. We haven't been able to document that at all.
And you get that data from cameras?
No, we get that data from going out and actually looking at the carcass of the animal that's been killed. Wolves kill them a certain way, lions kill them another way. We look at their bone marrow to see if they died of malnutrition. So our field crews are trained to determine the cause of death. So part of our monitoring is this cause-specific mortality. If you don't know what they're dying from, you can't address it. So
sure.
we are monitoring mortality by wolves and other predators and malnutrition.
And so basically the science is telling you that mountain lions kill more than wolves kill with elk.
In the Panhandle.
Or is it all ungulates?
In the Panhandle.
Is there
right now?
Has there been an influx in mountain lions recently?
We don't have a population estimate statewide on lions.
Well, we were talking about,
but
yeah.
Generally speaking, lions are on the upswing in abundance across the state. Is our feeling.
So for an elk hunter, it would be fair to say that the concern should be as high about mountain lion as it is for wolves, and maybe.
So
go ahead.
This does relate to, you and I talked a little bit earlier. You had talked to our staff at the Coeur d'Alene office, and in Northern Idaho, we have a program right now. We kind of coined it the ecology of everything, but that is really looking at a multi-predator interaction with deer and elk, not just looking at wolves and elk or lions and deer, but we're really looking at the combined effect. What effects do
everything
lions have on wolves and vice versa, and how does that interaction work with ungulates, deer and elk and moose?
Do you have any data on that? Like what lions versus wolves, how they interact?
Too early. We're just kicking this off.
I've always wondered that. There was a video going around of a mountain lion just saucing a wolf somewhere.
Right.
And somebody got it on video right off a road.
Right, I saw that.
So this ecology of everything.
But I'm not here to vilify. I mean.
Oh no,
right?
And I'm not either.
What we try to do, Jim, is understand these dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
You got to know what's causing it if you're going to address it. And if you're chasing the wrong thing, you need to know what is going on the landscape. And so we do spend a lot of time, energy, and money studying these ungulate populations and these predators to know what the behavior and the relationship is.
What about in southern Idaho? It's not the mountain lions are not creating the same havoc as they are up here on the elk. Is that kind of what the consensus is?
Yeah, again, I don't have the ecology of everything going on in southern Idaho. It's a focus that we've got going on in northern Idaho. We have typically more of our elk populations across the southern tier of the state tend to be pretty healthy regardless.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, a few of them are considerably over-objective, and we're dealing with problems associated with an overabundance of elk rather than not enough elk.
And that might tie into what one of the questions was regarding that depredation kill this last summer.
Yeah.
And what I dug into this, so I think I have a basic understanding, but I think the reaction, which is typical on social media, the reaction is kind of like, these gunslinging actions or reactions where you're just shooting from the hip. But there was like 204 elk that were killed, and this wasn't in one night.
Right.
Like a lot of people reacted that way. The question that I have about that though is when you have these super healthy populations in southern Idaho, but we kind of feel up in northern Idaho that our populations are suffering, and especially in like the low zone where the hunters or the harvest statistics can kind of back that claim that they're struggling. Why aren't those elk transported instead of killed?
Good question, legitimate question. So we know that elk have been moved around the country to establish populations, et cetera, et cetera. The short answer, there's never a short answer with Ed, right? Those 200 elk, I just want to make sure folks understand, were taken at 5 different locations, at 5 different depredations, although 172 of them did come from one place.
And this was over several weeks or months?
4.5 months.
4.5 months, okay.
4.5 months at a location where we paid a depredation claim the previous year of over $1 million of sportsman's money for crop damage.
To one farmer?
To one farmer. It was a place where a couple of years ago, when House Bill 230 passed the legislature and we got some additional revenue for the depredation program, both prevention and the claims side. Again, remember, the legislature sets the policy and we implement it. So the law tells us we are responsible for crop damage and there are limits and et cetera. We also got $1 million for access, which we have used to get almost 900,000 acres of private timberland in northern Idaho open for hunting, fishing, and trapping. We can talk about that later. That's a great deal.
Yeah, no, it is.
But House Bill 230 gave us this additional revenue for claims and prevention. And it also changed the law about requirements for hunter access onto the property. So it's not a requirement anymore. It used to be if a landowner did not allow reasonable access to hunters on his land in the prior year, he couldn't file a claim this year. That's not in the law anymore. So some laws changed, and we, as an agency, based on the law, were expected to be more responsive to these claims. Well, here's a guy who, by no fault of his own, other than where he farms, has a herd of over 400 elk that live in the deep canyon, timbered, and come out at night and go onto his organic potatoes and other crops and trample them and cause a bunch of damage. And so we made a decision a couple of years ago to try to add some science capacity to this depredation question. So we put two graduate students through the University of Idaho, one studying the effects of whitetail deer on agriculture, primarily in the Clearwater region, and the other one was looking at ways to try to reduce elk impacts in southern Idaho. We've got a really growing issue with the amount of corn being grown for the dairy industry in southern Idaho and the overlap between elk distribution and corn production. And so we're really trying to get a better science-based handle on, if you ever tried to get elk out of a circle of corn, it's tough. So anyway, we've got some graduate students. We're trying to figure things out, and one of the treatments we did with the graduate student work, and we focused it on this place because we knew we had a big problem there, is to what effect is a lethal aspect of hazing going to help you reduce the overall damage. So part of that study design, we said we're going to go to this place, and when we haze these elk and run them off of his operation, which by the way is like 2,700 acres of spuds and other crops, you're going to lay a few of them on the ground. And that's going to help, this is the theory, is that's going to help the rest of them get the message not to come back.
So the idea is these other elk are like, okay, Aunt Susie just got laid out, and we need to get the hell out of here. Yeah. That's the idea.
Yeah. So it was at night, on a farm at a place where we had safety concerns, and we made a decision to use department staff to remove those elk. Right or wrong, that's some of the controversy and some of the criticism that we're getting is you should have used hunters. You should have used licensed hunters in that program. Because of the safety concerns, we chose not to, and so I'll take the criticism for making that decision. But so over the span of 4.5 months, we did take 173 elk. We had a refrigerated car out there. When those elk were put on the ground, we quartered them, put them in a refrigerated cart, delivered them into a meat processor, and then we worked with hunters for the hungry to distribute those elk to needy folks through food banks. One reason or another, the processor got backlogged when hunting season started, and he didn't get them all done, and there was 30 or 40 elk in quarters stacked up there waiting to be processed, and some folks took some pictures of that and said, this is the travesty. So that's kind of the background. The result was we reduced that damage. I think the claim this year was $80,000 on that place. So it was an effective deterrent to the depredation, and we did save the license buyers, the sportsmen, a considerable amount of money on the previous year's claim. But we do have some concern by folks of, well, you should use sportsmen. And I just want folks to know that in all of the other depredation hunts in the state this year, those weren't the only ones. We did have, I think, 2,700 deer tags in the hands of hunters to help relieve depredations, and 2,500 elk tags in the hands of hunters to relieve depredations. This was a particular site-specific thing where we felt this was the best approach.
Yeah, and personally, I don't care if it's hunters or Idaho Fish and Game doing the deed, right? What my concern with that is $1 million went to this farmer. Mm-hmm. Does this farmer, in particular, do they allow hunting on their property at all, or is that something you can even comment on, or?
So this is a private land state.
It is a private land state.
And this particular farmer, his crop has an organic status. So to allow hunting on that jeopardizes the value of his crop by negating its organic status. So it is a very site-specific example.
So he's got $1 million of damage in organic potatoes.
Yep.
And we go kill 174 elk over 4 months. My problem is, I get the science part where we're trying to put it in the mind of these elk that this isn't a safe space. It's not a safe place for us to be. We need to move on. That it makes sense to me. To that extent, maybe it doesn't make sense to me, that number, and especially when we look at some of the population issues we're having in northern Idaho.
Right. So I wanted to give that background just to let everybody know what So the initial reports were those elk were all taken in one night, and they were left laying in the field, and they froze to the ground, and they were wasted, etc. I just wanted to try to address that. Your question specifically was, why didn't you just move those elk?
Yeah.
So I said elk have been moved, but Jim, when elk are moved, you do that in the dead of winter. You don't do it in July and August in the heat of the summertime. You don't corral up 60 or 80 head of elk and put them in a stock truck when it's 100 degrees.
Yeah, I get that.
Because none of them would be alive when you let them out of the truck in northern Idaho. So this depredation is occurring in the summertime, and you don't transport elk in the summertime. So
I feel like because you paid out $1 million a year before, and they had that winter to maybe corral them up and move them.
They're not there in the winter.
Where do they go in the winter?
Someplace else.
They're just not.
Miles away.
The issue is when the farmer has the crops.
Absolutely.
And that's
when that crop is gone, the elk are gone.
Okay.
And there is no continuing depredation because there's no crop left.
Gotcha. And I don't mean to try to hammer you on this.
No.
It's like sometimes as a hunter and as an outdoorsman, and I'm as a hunter, I care more about our wildlife, I think, than non-hunters do.
Sure.
And I think that's true for any hunter, and that's what a lot of anti-hunters don't understand. We care because we don't look at the killing part of the hunt. We look at these animals are a resource. They're our lifestyle. They are crucial to our way of life, especially in Idaho. So I won't say that. I mean, it's the same for a hunter in Montana or Wyoming. But
sure.
So when I look at that and I see that, it hurts me. It's like 200 elk are killed on this guy's farm. And I don't mean to pick on the farmer, but I'm irritated with the fact that $1 million went to this one particular farm because it's organic status. And I know that this is an investment. This is his way of life. This is his farmer's business, and he does need to protect his business. It just hurts. The whole thing hurts. It'd sure be nice to get those elk up in North Idaho and just see more elk like we used to, because we don't anymore up here. We just don't see the numbers, and I don't know what data you might have on that. But let's maybe, unless you have anything else to say on that particular subject, maybe shift gears to some more positive topics.
So this is a great segue to a positive topic, and it's directly related to what you just talked about. So there are some, and you and I talked previously, the same methodology that we're using to generate a statewide wolf population estimate relies heavily on the use of cameras, the same kind of game cameras, and but we have literally hundreds of them placed across the occupied range that wolves occupy in Idaho. And they took 11 million pictures this last year in order to generate this estimate of wolf abundance in the state. We're using the same technology in this part of the country where you have this heavy forest canopy, and we can't count elk with a helicopter like we do southern Idaho.
Yeah, definitely not.
Unit 6, we've never had an elk population estimate. Never. All we know is how many hunters hunt there, what the success rate is, what the percent of spike bulls or 6-point bulls. So we know what's going on from the hunting side of it.
6 is panhandle, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But we don't know what the population is.
We went hunting for mule deer down. Oh, I better not say that. There's too many hunters listening to this.
But now with the use of camera, for the first time ever, we've generated a population estimate for elk in Unit 6. So your concern about, we don't know what's going on with elk. We don't know if the trend is up or the trend is down, if it's a change in behavior, if it's a change in distribution, or if it's a change in population. We are implementing tools now that will let us address that in places we've never been able to address before. And I think that's a positive thing. And that's
sure.
to the concerns of elk hunters in this part of the country on, we don't know how many we've got, which is kind of the basic tenet of some of the things we do. I'll tell you, we're also implementing that for whitetail deer for the first time ever. We are estimates on the hoof, buck-doe ratios, doe-fawn ratios, buck quality indexes from cameras, and we're going to have better information on whitetail deer than we've ever had, ever, in Idaho. And these are things that have been brought to the attention and the need of the commission and therefore the department by the hunting public, and we're being responsive to those, and because we do need information to make good decisions. Whitetail have been something that have for a long, I know this will be controversial if I say it this way, but they've really kind of been underutilized for a long time, and now the popularity of whitetail hunting is such that maybe hunting mortality is more of a factor on whitetail populations and quality of bucks than it used to be, and we need to know that. And
Sure.
The hunting public has told us that, and we're being responsive to that. And so we have expanded our monitoring program to include cameras, and we're doing more work on moose than we've ever done, trying to understand what's going on with our moose population. We're not happy with the reduction in moose tags over the last few years.
Yeah.
Not happy about that, and we need to understand what's going on beyond predation. And everybody wants to point a finger at predation, and we know that's part of the problem in some places.
Yeah.
But we have moose population declines resulting in fewer tags in places we have no wolves.
Yeah.
So that's not the only answer.
I
It's
think,
just part of it.
Like I said earlier, it's easier to point. It's super easy to point at wolves for everything, right? But we also have to, as hunters and outdoorsmen, we do have to remember, like, Alaska has wolves, and they have a very good balanced ecosystem between elk and moose and wolves, and they all, it's achievable. And so I agree with what you said. It's not always about predation, and there's a lot of factors that go into it that people don't sometimes bother to look into.
Well, and sometimes it is about predation.
Oh, sure.
And we've identified some places where that is a limiting factor, total predation. And then you got to look at what predator is providing the most effect, but it's not always. It's not the one blanket reason that everything's on the downslide.
In that the whitetail issue that you were talking about, there's been a pretty big reduction in like your Boone and Crockett type bucks being listed from North Idaho, North Central Idaho, these regions. What's been taking place in those areas in terms of the whitetail? Why do you think there's fewer whitetail down there? Do you guys have answers to that yet?
No, we don't have answers to that yet. I think anecdotally you could say that there are fewer per capita that show up in the harvest surveys. Some of the criticisms we heard from whitetail hunters is your metrics, the number of bucks with 4 points on the left side, is not accurate enough to describe the quality of bucks. So we're taking that. So I brought you, I'm sorry, slam my hand. You told me
that's
not to do
okay.
that?
That's okay. You're allowed one hand slam per episode.
I brought you the new whitetail deer management plan that identifies that we're going to be collecting more data, and we're going to work on ways to better classify bucks by age so that we know what is going on in the population from a trend over time. We are also looking at effects of predation on whitetails. We've never done that before. So we're going to try to just have a better understanding, and that deer plan says in the next 6 years. It seems like a long time for hunters, but in the big scheme of things, we're gonna gather these better data to better inform deer management, and we're going to engage with the public on what they want from their deer hunting, and we're going to match up the biology and the desires, and we're going to try to really understand what the deer hunting public, quote unquote, understanding that there's 100 different deer hunting publics who all want something a little bit differently, and we're going to try to describe what that is and how important it is that everybody have a chance to continue to go hunting every year versus how important it is to manage for Boone and Crockett bucks. That's always
an interesting topic, what you just brought up, the different types of deer hunting public that we have, because there's a pretty extreme diversity of hunters and philosophies and ideas and opinions and everything else in the state of Idaho.
Sure.
How do you guys manage that as an agency? How does I can't even wrap my head around all the different facets of that.
So let me try to put it this way. You can't give everybody everything they want every place, but you can give some people some of what they want someplace. So where I would just describe the mule deer hunting framework as more sophisticated than the whitetail hunting framework. The whitetail hunting framework has been kind of a one-size-fits-all. Longer, general seasons where folks have a lot of time and opportunity to go, and includes a rut hunt.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, general mule deer seasons close before the rut. And any place we're hunting mule deer in the rut is a controlled hunt where we know the number of permits is limited and we can keep a real close track on that. And we offer some units we're managing for really quality animals, and others we're managing for lots of general opportunity that folks know, hey, we can have a deer camp here every year and I don't have to see if I can draw a tag. So there's just a lot more diversity in the regs in which we use to manage mule deer. And if that's what the public wants to get to with whitetail, it probably would look different in the future rather than generally longer season that includes opportunity to hunt during the rut to some general seasons and maybe controlled hunts during the rut. But yeah. I make no foregone conclusion about that. That's going to take real engagement from the hunting public, and we will have to do a good job of surveying in a random way to really get the general feeling instead of the squeaky wheel feeling. So that's an important part. And to that end, we have added some capacity at the University of Idaho. We are co-funding a professor to help us with that survey work. We hired him specifically in a partnership with the University of Idaho not to help us understand what non-hunters think about hunting. We hired him to help understand what our hunters want from their hunting. So,
Gotcha.
Lots of times, Jim, we get criticized for the social science that we do, the surveys that we do. So we're going to expand our capacity and bring in some help in
Gotcha.
that regard.
That's super interesting to know. Yeah, that's a man. I don't want your job.
You should.
No, I don't want it. Other than I want access to the 11 million pictures from all the trail cameras.
Most of them were empty. Most of them were empty. I can tell you that. So interesting to deal with that kind of data. So we've been working with Microsoft with software that's a lot like facial recognition. So, the New York City police can look at all the cameras in the subway using facial recognition software. They can pick out a criminal and know he got on the subway bus. So we're using some stuff that's similar to that to sort through all the blank pictures. Because if we had one person sitting in a computer looking through 11 million pictures, we might get done 6 years from now.
Yeah.
So it's really automated, and this artificial intelligence or the facial recognition software is really helping us work through that.
Well, how does that help with blank pictures?
If the software doesn't recognize the image of a animal,
oh, gotcha,
it goes into the trash can. If there's nothing in the picture, it's blank, and we know we had 9,782,000 blank pictures.
Uh-huh.
So here's the upside. 11 million pictures, not one of Bigfoot.
No Bigfoot?
No Bigfoot.
Man, you need to put some cameras out here. Pretty sure my neighbor's got one pinned up back on the other side of that tree line. What when you were talking about the whitetail seasons and the liberal seasons, but we have a super good long season up here, but it's mainly rifle season. Is there anything in the works to talk about maybe during the rut switching some of that to some of the units to bow season, or some would say it's too liberal of a season for rifle hunters?
Right.
What do you think of that?
That's not up to me.
So public opinion would dictate that to the commission?
Yeah.
And then you would carry that out?
Yeah, and that's part of the real desire to measure what the deer hunting public thinks. And that is a challenge in the public opinion part, because I can tell you, as a manager, I've held public meetings where I've had 40 people in the room,
mm-hmm.
all with the exact same opinion on how it should be managed. But they were like-minded people, and they all came there because they wanted to get something different than what was in place, and what they wanted was not consistent with what the survey about what anglers told us they wanted. So they come with a vested interest, right?
Yep.
And they make their point, and we listen. And this is back to your earlier comment about criticisms that the Fish and Game Department doesn't listen to us. I would say we do listen. We just don't always do what you want, because we're weighing it against the wants and desires of a whole bunch of other folks as well.
And science.
Yeah. So you're listened to. Because you don't get the outcome you want doesn't mean you weren't listened to. It means it just didn't work out that way.
I think a lot of that evolves out of, I'm not speaking for everybody, but I think a lot of that evolves out of hunting is this, it's so emotionally charged. It's so, we get so worked up and we get so wrapped into it. We look forward to it all year. Then season hits and then we don't get anything. And, it's such a disappointment. I think a lot of that is where that comes from. Because personally, I feel like, and I've lived in enough different places that I'm comfortable in saying this. And I don't want this to sound like too soft of an interview, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I feel like Idaho Fish and Game listens more than any other agency in any other state that I've ever lived in. And I would stand behind that comment. And so I don't know. We already covered that.
Well, I appreciate that. that we're going to sit here and blow warm smoke up each other's pant leg about the Mutual Admiration Club, but I think we do listen, and we go to great lengths to make sure that there's opportunity for folks to weigh in. Our commitment to hiring Dr. Kenny Wallen at the University of Idaho is a commitment to our public. That's not a commitment to the agency. That's a commitment to our public that we want to do the best job we can when we survey people so that it's meaningful and it does inform the commission in meeting the most desires of the public that we can and still be within the biology of the animal.
Gotcha.
That's a commitment.
Yeah, for sure. That being said, let's talk about how hunters can be heard. And the best way
So before you go, I just want to go back. Why are people so passionate? And, I worked on the fish side for a long time, and anglers are passionate too.
Oh, yeah.
They're not as passionate as hunters. Okay? And I think part of the reason, having been in the game a long time, is you can fish for something, somewhere, all the time.
Yep.
A lot of our fishing season and the bag limits are multiple, and you can go day after day after day. And if you're a big game hunter, you got one elk tag.
Exactly.
And you're planning all year, and you're super dedicated, and you're super excited. So why is game management, game itself, especially big game, such a contentious issue? And I think that's all upside. It's contentious because people are super passionate about it, because it is very important to them. And there's a lot of strong opinions about it. And so those opinions and that passion come to, I want to make sure that in the future I get to do the things I love to do. Who wouldn't be passionate about that? Why wouldn't you expect that to bring its own set of controversy? Yeah. That's upside, Jim. I don't look at that as a negative, that people love it to the point that they live it and they eat it and they breathe it.
No, it's definitely a positive thing. I mean, what's the point if you're not passionate about it? Because it is expensive, it's time consuming, and it's mind focused, I guess. And it I know it's stolen my focus from things that maybe it shouldn't have been stolen from in the past.
Yeah, that's fair, right?
Maybe I should go to work instead of hunting today, you know. But no, so I think that is definitely a positive thing for sure. And it's just a science in itself. The biology of the animals that you guys are managing, and the science of managing these hunters, and all of our different opinions, and how passionate we get about them, because we do get fired up. I know for sure. You included, as a hunter.
Yeah.
So when we're, I got a question on that note. We touched on bow hunting for a minute. What is the deal with lighted nocks? Why is Idaho like the only state that doesn't allow lighted nocks, and why is it so contentious? I don't really have an opinion one way or the other on those, by the way.
So that is not the director's decision. That's the commission's decision. So certain things, season setting, for example, when it opens, when it closes, that's all the purview of the commission. They don't refer to anybody in the legislature to do that. Rules, Jim, on the other hand, are different. So the rule to remove a diverter from a wolf snare, the commission starts that, but those rules get stood up by the legislature. The legislature has the ability to say, not so much, or they approve the rule, and then it goes into the administrative rule packet. And lighted nocks, things that are not biological, the draw let off on a bow, the definition of a hook, minimum caliber of muzzle loader for hunting deer or elk.
Yep.
Those are things set in rule. So the commission starts that, but they're legislatively approved. The non-resident quota for elk tags is a rule. So that's beyond the commission authority, but it starts with the commission.
Gotcha.
So lighted nocks, expanding broadheads, the restriction to put an electronic device mounted to your bow. You can't have a rangefinder built into your scope. Those kind of things are rules, and there is a public process. When the commission entertains a change in rule, It gets noticed in the public bulletin. We ask people if they want to negotiate an outcome. It's a 12-month process to change rules. And this isn't an excuse. I just want folks to understand that the lighted knox thing is a rule. It's not a season. But the commission has not been willing to do it. And speaking for the commission, the reason is they're concerned about the slippery slope of technology. And they're trying to keep, you might laugh, right? Because a double wheel compound bow is anything but primitive. But really, archery, muzzleloader are under the context of primitive weapons that offer more of an advantage to the animal than the hunter. That can be argued by many, and it is, but we don't allow certain things on muzzleloader guns because we want our muzzleloader seasons to continue to be a primitive type weapon. Exposed caps, not 209 primers. You can use a muzzleloader with a 209 primer and a scope during a rifle season, but you can't use one during a muzzleloader only season. But back to the reason lighted knox is the commission is just teetering on, if you do that, then the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and pretty soon they want radio receivers in the base of the arrow so you can track the animal after it's been hit. And I didn't just make that up. Those are actually technologies that are out there right now. And the commission has thus far just held firm on the technology has gone far enough, and this is all we're going to allow.
So if a group wanted to advocate for lighted knox, they start with the commission.
Absolutely.
And then the commission would move it to the legislators. Mm-hmm. And so those dang politicians where the buck ends at that point, huh?
Well, no. I think that would be unfair to characterize it as the buck ends with the politicians. So the commission somebody will come in and say, for the 7th or 8th or 18th time, we want you guys to look at changing the rule and allow lighted knox. So the commission listens to that and they look around the table and they go, so are we going to change our position on lighted knox? And every time they've done that, it's no, we're not. So we're not going to go through the rulemaking process to allow lighted knox.
Okay.
And so if they did decide to do that, if they decided to do that, Jim, that would be the start of many public meetings where people would come in and weigh, and we would put a survey on the website. The commission is entertaining a change to the lighted knock rule. Do you support or oppose that? And we'd start to get that kind of feedback.
Gotcha.
And then if it got through all of that and the commission decided to make a change, that change would need to be ratified by the legislature.
Okay. Yeah. I'm glad. That's good clarity to have.
Sure.
And especially because, again, in terms of lighted knox, me personally, I don't really have a preference on that. What I am concerned about is, you had mentioned, I didn't know this, in the state of Idaho, we cannot have a rangefinder within our scope.
Right.
Oh, interesting. Okay, because I'm in the market for a scope, but I'm mainly a bow hunter. But I do have a nice new rifle that I want to scope on, and I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, so you can have a lighted reticle in the scope, but you can't have a built-in rangefinder.
Okay. It's good to know. I got to pull one of my scope options off the
I think
table.
It's page 100 in this book right here you got on your table. If you look at that, it says you can't have any electronic device attached to the gun except a lighted reticle in a scope.
See, the last 5 years, or actually longer than that, almost a decade, that I've hunted with a rifle, it's been open sights. And so that's just interesting. Not something I've ever looked into. But now I have a new 300 Win Mag. I'm gonna scope up. So I've been looking. But have you ever hunted up here in the Panhandle? You've hunted up here, haven't you?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I lived up here for a couple of years. Hunted whitey. Hunted some elk up here.
Nice.
Yeah.
And we were gonna. I do want to get back to we were going to get into, and then we circled back to that other topic, how hunters can best have a voice with the Idaho Fish and Game. I really want people to, when this episode's over with, they have a better understanding. I think we've clarified a few big points here so far.
Yeah.
One being that out-of-staters, in terms of these surveys, these non-random surveys, have no effect on what the commission decides to pursue. Or I don't know if I said that right, but
so let me just say, Jim, if we got some comment from anybody, including a non-resident, that was we just never had really thought about it, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons you ask people for comments is maybe you hadn't thought about it. Mm-hmm. If there was a really great idea that came in that nobody had been considering, regardless of who it came from, if it was like earth-shattering, oh my God, this solves the problem, the commission would consider that.
I think my concern was more a bunch of pro-wolf, they don't understand the dynamics of managing wolves and living in wolf country,
right.
Out of San Francisco, California, or somewhere like that,
right.
Outweighing the Idaho residents' opinion or comments, not so much like a non-resident hunter coming in with comments, because we should
right.
welcome those.
Right.
But that's, I think, what the concern was. So, and we talked about that, voicing opinions as hunters to the Idaho Fish and Game. I know that those meetings are crucial. How often do those meetings take place?
So I think what you're talking about is the scoping meetings. Uh-huh. So so right now the fishing regulations are a 3-year brochure. So we only change the fishing regs, the general fishing regs, every 3rd year.
Okay.
The hunting regs are biennial, so they're a 2-year regulation mm-hmm. cycle. So generally speaking, the year the regs are going to change, the department, my staff, will hold meetings with the public. And we call that scoping. So what's working for you, what's not working for you, to have any ideas on things you want to see done differently. And we have some ideas we want to share with you based on the change in biology or whatever might be going on. We see an opportunity for more hunting or fishing, or we see a need to tighten things up. Mm. And then we start to have conversations with folks.
Okay.
And then we engage with the commission, and the commission helps us understand what they're hearing. And so then we get these proposals. The commission authorizes the staff to take proposals to change the rules, the regs, mm-hmm. not the rules, the seasons, right? Yeah. And so then we get feedback, and we put that on the web. And since the web, we have a whole lot more people providing input through the computer than come to public meetings anymore. It's just a change in the way the culture works anymore.
It's just a shift. I think it's like that with anything. Yeah.
It's easier. But that's where that starts. The other thing, so a really effective model is the organized sportsmen's groups, where they have the ability to meet and talk among themselves and kind of air out what they'd like to see different and the frustrations they might be having, and they have a point of contact, the leader of the group or whoever, that comes sometimes and sits down with our staff, our professionals, and say, so here's what we're thinking. Can you explain why you do this or don't do this? Can I understand better the biology behind it? And they're kind of a liaison between their membership and the department in a learning way.
So an example of that would be like the Foundation for Wildlife Management.
Yeah, to some degree. I think really effectively lately has been the Idaho Trappers Association.
Trappers, yep.
Yeah, yep. And Rusty Kramer is their executive director, mm-hmm. and he really has been working hard to understand the why of the regulations that we have and point out places that their membership think we could make some changes for the better. And that's worked really well. And the commission just set trapping seasons in the state, and quite a few of the proposals they brought were very well thought out. They had run them to ground with us on the biological side, and things that they wanted to, for example, expand the areas where otters were trapped. Otters are managed under a statewide quota, so it doesn't really matter where you take them, because once you get 6 or 3 or 4 or 2, the season closes. So they wanted more place to go, but no change in the quota, and biologically we could stand that up. So I just say that's an example of real effective interactions through kind of a spokesman who works hard to understand what the members of their group want, and not just leave it at that and come to the commission and meeting and say, and my group, by God, wants this.
Yeah.
And my group wants this, and I've worked with the staff, and we've modified our thinking based on a better understanding of the biology, and here's where we'd like to go.
Gotcha.
That's been pretty cool to see that happen.
Yeah. That's good to know, because it helps, like I've got memberships with all sorts of these foundations. Right.
But
Mountain Elk.
But understand that he's representing a pretty small, because the trappers, like there aren't 140,000 like there are deer hunters. Yeah. So to focus what deer hunters want from one group, that's still going to be a process that includes a whole bunch more feedback.
Okay. Well, we're getting on to about 2.5 hours here.
Wow.
Time flies when you're having fun.
I guess.
You going to come back on the podcast?
Yeah.
Or did I scare you away?
No, this has been fun.
Good. No, I'm super glad you're here. I have the one question I have. What do you think the biggest misconception of hunters, or that hunters have about wildlife management? Is that could be a wild card, but
yeah. So we talked about it a little earlier, and I think one of the misconceptions is that you can stockpile wildlife. That, we talked about a few years ago, we did back-to-back winters across southern Idaho where we had mule deer fawn survival that was off the chart. Year after year after year. And the mule deer population grew by 25%. Hunter participation went up. Number of bucks in the harvest went up. Percent 4 point in the harvest went up. And it was really great. And just a couple winters in a row can knock fawn recruitment down. And instead of having 85% survival of mule deer fawns, you got 62 or 40. Or Snowmageddon, there were a couple of our places that had virtually zero.
2007, 2008 was probably pretty rough.
17, the Snowmageddon winter, we had some of our eco regions where we had single-digit mule deer fawn survival rates.
That's disappointing.
It is super disappointing and a big setback. So we cut down antlerless hunting, cut the antlerless youth tags out to rebuild. But winter there's no bigger single contributor to mule deer mortality than a really bad winter.
Yeah.
And you can't just manage for a population that's twice the capacity of the winter. So when the population is growing, there is a conception of we can ride this wave forever. If we just put the right regulation on it, the population will never get smaller again. And so we tend to respond to an increase in population with increased opportunity.
Gotcha.
And then you get a bad winter, and 2 years later the population is down because it's a recruitment issue. And more often than not, the public says, see, I told you, Fish and Game managed it. They shot all the deer, and that's why the population is bad, because they didn't save them all. They overhunted them. And I think that's a big misconception. And it's an easy thing to think it's directly
it's the
cause and
management
effect.
versus whether or something else. So that's an interesting part of that. I've had the winters here. I had to shovel snow off of the roof out here because it was getting so deep, and so I just can't imagine how the mule deer fare through that. What are some of the bigger initiatives coming up 2020, 2021 for the Idaho Fish and Game that you think people should know about?
Well, we talked about the non-resident management thing, and certainly that's really important for the commission, and I think so far we're lined up to be able to implement those things. And we're focused a lot on hunting. We're certainly disappointed with the trend for salmon and steelhead and the dismal fisheries we've had over the past few years, and really hopeful for a turnaround there. We know that the action agencies, the Corps of Engineers, Bonneville Power Administration, and NOAA are going to come out with a new opinion on how to manage the Federal Columbia hydro system and so we're paying a lot of attention to that. We have status where we're working inside of the agreement with them to help shape that. So, the governor's put a lot of emphasis on his salmon working group and trying to find some Idaho solutions to the current problem. It's pretty tough for the governor of Idaho to tell the Pacific Ocean to turn itself around and be a place where salmon and steelhead are going to survive again. That cycles through time. We're going to see that come back up again, but that's been really disappointing, and we'd like to see that turned around. Although, again, the ability to influence what has been, the ocean is good, we call it green. When the ocean's bad, it's red, and it's been really red, and not a hospitable place for Idaho salmon and steelhead, or anybody else's for that matter. Sure. The things I talked about, back to wildlife, the monitoring that we're doing, the enhancements we're making. I call it, when I got the job, people said, "God, well, what's your job really about?" And I said, "It's about balance and stretch." And so we just try to balance so much stuff: the interest of the public, the biological capacity of the resource in an environment that's always changing. You really got to be able to shift your weight and be pretty nimble to stay balanced with the wants of the people and the ability of the resource to do it. And you have to recognize the threats. The stretch part is my agency and the people in my agency that work on behalf of the people to stretch ourselves, from the technologies that are available to learning new ways to get information to inform the commission's decisions. And I sit here unabashed and say I'm super excited for the stretching that we're doing with technologies, with game cameras, with telemetry collars, understanding the causes of death for our wildlife populations. And Jim, we are population focused. And you go back to, why is it so controversial? Why are people so passionate on the non-hunting side or on the hunting side? And that passion comes more from the individual animals, whether it's the elk I'm going to try to harvest this year or the wolf that somebody from New York doesn't want to die. They're focused on individual animals. And as an agency and a professional management organization, we don't manage individuals. We manage populations, and it is most important for us to stay focused on what the population is doing, and that's about recruitment, and that's about mortality, and the understanding of both of them and how that gets allocated. And it's super important.
Yep. And it's a super important distinction.
It is super important that people always are part of the allocation of mortality, that we manage it for their interaction with it.
Yeah. Super good stuff. I feel like I'm missing stuff that I wanted to talk about, but we've covered a lot of ground here.
Some of it a couple of times.
Yeah, a couple of times, and that's okay. We were on one of my episodes. We were talking. I think it was the wolf episode. But he was talking about how people need to hear things like 7 times to actually retain it, kind of thing. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've heard it several times over my life. So a little bit of repetitiveness is fine. You got any dream hunts coming up this year for you personally? You got any cool tags you drew? Well, of course, we're not through the draw season yet.
Not through the draw season yet. So, in all honesty, I've been last couple of years just putting in for either sex muzzleloader elk hunt. My daughter's been going with me, and I'm an easy guy to play. I don't go out of state. This Idaho is where I play.
Yeah.
And not just because I'm the director of the agency. Idaho has everything I want, and I can challenge myself to no end with the things that we have here. And I've just really got into this late season muzzy stuff, and it's just a lot of fun. So I hope I can draw. If I don't, I'll have to have a backup hunt someplace and see how that goes.
You've always got over the counter.
We always have over the counter, and that's important for a lot of reasons.
Now, if you weren't director of Idaho Fish and Game, what would you be?
I have no idea.
You'd be a hunting podcaster, right?
I would probably not be a podcaster, but I would definitely be hunting more than I'm hunting. Yeah, so one of my hobbies, I maintain my sanity by doing a little woodworking. So I've got a shop, and I like to make furniture and cabinets and stuff like
really?
that. Yeah. So
I didn't know that. That's pretty cool.
I don't think I'd be able to make a living at it, but like I said, when you asked me what's one of the best things about being director, and that's and I said the ability to get things done. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's pretty intangible in my work, and I'm a person who needs something tangible. So I do sometimes occupy my time making sawdust and putting things together, and at the end of the day I can say, hey, look, I finished this, and that's important to me.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a hobby of mine, but it takes second fiddle to hunting and fishing.
Oh, I don't blame it. Everything takes second to hunting and fishing for me too. So other than my wife and kids, and then it's hunting. Sorry, Andrew, don't be offended over there. Is there anything that you want to share with the listeners in terms of how they can follow along with the Idaho Fish and Game? Is there a Facebook page they should be on, a regional page, or Instagram, anything like that?
So there are multiple Facebook pages. The regions post on Facebook page, all 7 regions, and headquarters shares stuff through the regional pages we push out. The web page, if you've not gone there, there's a lot of information.
There's a ton.
One thing that our new license vendor will have in the ability to serve our hunters and anglers is a place for you to check the box on things that interest you. If you're interested in getting updates on fishing, you can check the box, and we'll be sending those things out more regularly to folks who opt in for information. But the schedules about when we do public meetings and how to provide input, it is important to us. Mm-hmm. Even though sometimes it doesn't go the way people want it to go, if you're not engaged, you can't influence the outcome.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I agree. And this is my opinion. This is not the director of the Idaho Fish and Game, but I think people spend way too much time complaining on social media and not enough time doing something about it. And I don't say that to pick on anybody. I say that to maybe highlight the opportunity that's lost when that has taken place. And so I appreciate you coming on. Is there any closing thoughts you want to offer the audience here?
Well, maybe just in the context, because I say this in the letters. I write a personal letter to sportsmen and women in the front of the fishing regs and the hunting regs and the trapping regs, and now that we've talked a little bit about Title 36, the law that tells the Fish and Game Commission what their job is, and the director of the department what my job is, and how all of this stuff fits together. And we talked about the mission: preserve, protect, perpetuate, and manage all wildlife in the state, that it belongs to the state and we manage it for the citizens, to provide continuous supplies for fishing and hunting and trapping. Well, there's a whole bunch of wildlife in this state that we don't fish, hunt, and trap for.
Yeah,
in fact, the majority of the species we don't fish for, hunt for, or trap. Mm-hmm. but we still manage those. We don't use your license money to manage those, but they are important, and we manage them. And so I say, and I reiterate to my staff, our ability to manage all of the state's wildlife is best done when we're sure that we're impeccable in our ability to provide continued supplies for fishing and hunting and trapping, because that keeps everybody engaged, and that keeps the value of the resource and the experience and the importance, and to the extent that hunters and trappers and anglers can realize that they're better off being unified rather than archers being against rifle hunters and bait fishermen being against fly fishermen.
Totally agree.
The more they can be allies, the better off we're all going to be.
Yep, I totally agree. In fact, I think that topic has been touched on every episode of this podcast, and how we do need to, if we can reduce, some of the contentions between the different, facets of hunting and fishing, we'd be so much better off. We'd be so much better off, especially when you compare it to the alliances of anti-hunting organizations. They're a lot less contentious with each other than hunters can be. But hunting is like we talked about, it's a highly emotional, highly passionate way of life. And so, are you gonna get tell the governor to listen to this? By the way,
as soon as I get to see him.
All right.
Yeah.
And I think you should ask him to come on my podcast for me. I don't even know how to get a hold of the governor.
Oh, he'll answer email.
Oh, he will? Okay, good. I'm gonna email him. I want him to come. Just only for the sake. I want to get his take on some hunting topics too. So that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it would be fun. Sometimes when you talk to the governor, though, you talk about what the governor wants to talk about.
I know, right?
Indeed.
It'd be kind of honestly, it was intimidating having the director of the Fish and Game coming on.
Well, I hope you got beyond your intimidation.
I did.
Yeah.
I did. I think it's easy to get beyond that with you. I think you're a good guy for this position, and I just really appreciate you coming on. It's been a pleasure, and you're easy to talk to, and I like your honest approach with everything. So and again, the fact that you came up to Hayden, Idaho from Boise, to share your thoughts with the hunters of Idaho is a testament to your commitment to the hunters of Idaho, and I appreciate that.
Thanks for recognizing that.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation, guys. I appreciate you guys tuning in. We're just about going on to 2 hours 45 minutes here, so we're going to wrap this up right now. But if you guys like the director was saying, if you want to follow along with Idaho Fish and Game, definitely jump on those Facebook pages and get in touch. Thanks again for coming on, Ed. This has been a great talk.
You're welcome, Jim.
Hopefully at some point we can do it again.
Good.
Thank you.
Look forward to it.